I need to tell you about something that breaks every rule they taught us in agriculture school. My great-grandpa used to grow a crop that produced over 3,000 calories per square foot. You heard that right. 3,000 calories from 1 square foot of dirt. Now, before you think I'm spinning tales on this porch, let me put that number in perspective for you. Modern industrial corn, the crop that covers more American soil than anything else, the one they tell us feeds the world, it produces about 300 calories per square foot under perfect conditions, with perfect chemicals and perfect everything. We're talking 10 times more food from the same piece of ground. I remember sitting with my grandpa when I was maybe 8 years old, and he pointed to a patch of earth behind the old barn. He said his daddy grew something there that could feed a family of 6 all winter, from a plot smaller than our living room. I didn't believe him then, thought it was old man exaggeration, you know how that goes. But then I started digging through the old agricultural reports, the ones gathering dust in university basements, and I found the numbers. They were real, they were documented, and they were deliberately forgotten. This crop didn't need tractors, didn't need petroleum-based fertilizers shipped from halfway around the world, didn't need pesticides or herbicides or any of the chemicals that turn our waterways green and our soil dead. It actually made the soil better every single year you grew it. The native peoples who cultivated it for thousands of years understood something that we've spent the last century trying to bury under monoculture fields that stretch to the horizon. Here's what gets me about this whole thing. We're told that industrial agriculture is the only way to feed a growing population, that we need bigger machines, more chemicals, more control over every single aspect of how plants grow. But my ancestors fed themselves with hand tools and knowledge passed down through generations, and they got 10 times the calories from the same space. They didn't have crop insurance or government subsidies or contracts with seed companies. They had dirt and water and seeds they saved themselves and wisdom that went back further than anyone could remember. The reason you've never heard about this isn't because it didn't work. It's because it worked too well, without requiring anything they could sell you. Can't patent a growing method that's older than written history. Can't make you dependent on annual seed purchases when you save your own. Can't sell you the solution to problems that don't exist when you work with nature instead of against it. My grandpa died in 1992, and one of the last things he told me was that the forgetting wasn't an accident. He said when the agricultural extension agents came through in the 50s and 60s, they had one message for every small farmer: modernize or disappear. And modernize meant buying into a system that required you to purchase your inputs every single year. The crops that let you be independent, the ones that gave you food security without corporate dependency, those got labeled as primitive, inefficient, backwards. But 3,000 calories per square foot isn't primitive, it's extraordinary. And the fact that we replaced it with something that produces 1/10 of that and calls it progress, that should tell you everything you need to know about who benefits from the system we're living under. The old folks called them the Three Sisters, but that's the English translation, and it loses something in the crossing over. My great-grandpa's people, the Cherokee who stayed in these hills when the government tried to move everyone west, they had a different way of saying it. They called it a relationship, not just a planting method. Corn, beans, and squash grown together in a way that made each one stronger than it could ever be alone. Now I'm going to be specific here because the details matter. We're talking about flint corn varieties, not the sweet corn you buy at the grocery store. We're talking about pole beans that climb 10 feet up those corn stalks, fixing nitrogen in the soil while they grew. And we're talking about winter squash, with leaves so big they shaded out every weed and kept the moisture in the ground even during the dry spells that killed the European crops. My great-grandpa said his grandmother showed him how to plant them. You'd make a mound of earth about 1 foot high and 3 feet across. 4 corn seeds went in first, spaced in a square pattern. When that corn got about 6 inches tall, you'd plant 4 bean seeds around the base, one between each corn stalk. Week after that, you'd put in 2 squash seeds on opposite sides of the mound. Then you'd walk away and let them do what they'd been doing together for longer than anyone could count. The corn grew tall and gave the beans something to climb. The beans pulled nitrogen out of the air and fed it to the corn and squash through their roots. The squash spread out low and kept the weeds down and the moisture in. 3 plants taking care of each other without a single thing purchased from any store. The Haudenosaunee up north, the Muskogee in the south, the peoples of the southwest, they all knew this. Different varieties suited to different climates, but the same understanding of how these plants wanted to grow together. Here's where those 3,000 calories come from. 1 mound, 9 square feet if you count the spacing, would give you 4 corn stalks producing 2 to 3 ears each. Those beans would climb up and give you pounds of protein-rich seeds. That squash would spread out and produce fruits that weighed 10, 15, sometimes 20 pounds each and would store in a cool cellar until spring. You calculate the caloric value of all that from 9 square feet, and you're looking at numbers that make modern agriculture look like we're starving ourselves on purpose. The women in my family kept this knowledge alive, even when the men went off to work in factories and coal mines. My grandmother had a garden plot behind the house where she grew the 3 sisters every single year until she couldn't get down on her knees anymore. She saved the seeds in mason jars labeled in her handwriting. When she passed in 2003, we found jars of corn seeds that came from her grandmother, who got them from her grandmother. We're talking about seeds that survived the trail of tears, carried in pockets and hidden in clothing, because people knew that losing those seeds meant losing their ability to feed themselves. This wasn't just agriculture, it was sovereignty. It was the ability to eat without asking permission from any system or government or corporation. And that's exactly why it had to be erased. In 1621, a man named Edward Winslow wrote a letter back to England that I found in the historical archives. He was at Plymouth, watching the Wampanoag people tend their fields, and he wrote that 1 acre of their corn, beans, and squash produced more food than 3 acres of English wheat. He wasn't romanticizing it. He was confused. The Pilgrims were starving with their European methods, while the native peoples next to them were harvesting abundance from less land with less work. My grandpa showed me a book once published in 1842 by a surveyor named Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. He traveled through the Great Lakes region documenting everything he saw, and he wrote about Ojibwe women maintaining gardens that fed entire villages through brutal winters. He measured the plots, he counted the yields, he recorded that a family of 5 could sustain themselves year-round from a garden patch smaller than 40 feet by 40 feet. That's 1,600 square feet, feeding 5 people completely. Do that math against modern agriculture and try to explain how we call this progress. There was a French Jesuit priest, Paul Lejeune, who kept detailed journals in the 1630s. He wrote about Huron agricultural fields that produced such abundance that they traded surplus corn to neighboring peoples. He noted specifically that their methods required no plowing, no draft animals, and no metal tools beyond what they'd acquired through trade. The soil, he wrote, remained dark and rich year after year, while French colonial farms depleted their ground in 3 seasons and had to clear new forest. In 1804, Lewis and Clark came through Mandan and Hidatsa villages along the Missouri River. William Clark wrote in his journal about storage pits containing thousands of bushels of corn, beans, and squash. These weren't small gardens. These were agricultural operations feeding permanent settlements of thousands of people, and they'd been doing it in the same locations for generations without destroying the land. Clark noted that the Hidatsa women laughed at the expedition's struggle to grow anything in soil they considered perfect. My great-grandpa's uncle fought in the Civil War, and he told stories that got passed down about how Confederate and Union soldiers both survived by raiding gardens that used these methods. The industrial farms had collapsed because all the men were at war, but the family plots where women still planted the three sisters kept producing. He said you could tell which families knew the old ways because they weren't starving, while their neighbors with modern single-crop fields had nothing. A botanist named George Will published a study in 1917 after working with Hidatsa elders in North Dakota. He documented corn varieties that produced in conditions where hybrid corn failed completely. He recorded yields that exceeded commercial agriculture of his time by substantial margins. He noted that the intercropping method prevented pest damage without any interventions. His work was published by the North Dakota Agricultural College, and then it disappeared from their curriculum within a generation. In 1935, during the Dust Bowl, a county extension agent in Oklahoma named Howard Finnell wrote a report that never got wide distribution. He documented that the few farmers still using indigenous intercropping methods had topsoil and crops while everything around them blew away to nothing. The monoculture wheat fields turned to desert. The diverse plots stayed alive. His report suggested that industrial agriculture had caused the catastrophe. That report got filed away and forgotten. These weren't primitive people making do with inferior methods. These were sophisticated agriculturalists achieving results that we still can't match with all our technology. And every single witness who documented it got ignored. My grandpa was born in 1928, right before everything fell apart. He told me that during the Depression, the families who remembered the old ways ate while their neighbors starved. His mother planted the three sisters in every available patch of ground around their house, the front yard, the side yards, even in the ditch by the road. While men stood in bread lines in town, his family had corn to grind, beans to cook, and squash that lasted in the cellar until spring came around again. He said the government agents came through in '33 with programs to help farmers, but the help only went to people growing commodity crops the modern way. If you had a diverse garden using intercropping methods, you didn't qualify for assistance. You had to prove you were growing acres of single crops to get any support. So, people who were actually feeding themselves got nothing, while people who'd bought into monoculture and failed got bailed out. That's when he first understood the system wasn't designed to feed people. It was designed to make people dependent. During World War II, his uncle came back from Europe and talked about how the French and Italian peasants survived the occupation. They had small plots behind their houses where they grew multiple crops together. The Germans took the wheat from the big fields, but they couldn't find or didn't bother with the garden plots where families were actually getting their calories. He said the people who survived best were the ones who'd never fully modernized, who still knew how to grow food in ways that didn't require industrial inputs or large visible fields. My daddy was born in '46, right after the war ended. He remembered his grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, teaching him to plant when he was 5 years old. She'd been born in 1872, and she learned from people who learned from people who'd been doing it since before anyone was writing anything down. She told him that during the Civil War, her mother kept the family alive with a garden plot, while her father was off fighting. The Confederate money became worthless, and there was nothing to buy anyway, but those corn stalks and bean vines and squash plants didn't care about politics or economics. In 1973, when the oil embargo hit and food prices doubled, my parents planted the three sisters for the first time in their married life. My mama had thought it was old-fashioned and inefficient until she couldn't afford groceries anymore. That year, from a plot about 20 feet by 30 feet, they harvested enough to feed our family of 5 from September through March. She canned the beans, stored the squash in the cellar, and ground the corn into meal. She told me later that she'd spent her whole life being taught that modern agriculture was superior, and then one crisis proved that everything she'd been taught was backwards. The pattern repeats every single time the industrial system fails. During every war, every depression, every crisis, the people who survive are the ones who know how to produce food without depending on supply chains and petroleum and corporate seeds. But as soon as the crisis passes, the pressure comes back to modernize, to scale up, to buy into the system, and the knowledge gets buried again under a new generation of promises that this time the industrial method will finally deliver security. It never does. Security comes from knowledge and seeds you control and methods that work when everything else collapses. My family survived every catastrophe of the last 150 years because somebody remembered what the old folks knew. In 1948, a researcher named Russell Anderson at the University of Minnesota published a study comparing nutritional content of the Three Sisters system to monoculture crops. He found that the combination provided complete protein, something you rarely get from plant sources. The beans had the amino acids the corn lacked, and together they gave you everything your body needed. He calculated that 1 acre using traditional intercropping methods provided more usable nutrition than 3 acres of modern crops grown separately. The study was published once in an obscure agricultural journal and never referenced again in mainstream research. My uncle worked at the USDA research station in Beltsville, Maryland during the 1970s. He told me they ran trials comparing heirloom varieties grown in traditional combinations against hybrid monocultures. The heirloom intercropped plots required 0 pesticides because the diversity prevented pest establishment. They required 0 synthetic fertilizer because the beans fixed nitrogen and the decaying squash leaves added organic matter. They retained soil moisture better, preventing erosion, and they produced more calories per acre when you counted all 3 crops together. He said the results were documented, filed, and never mentioned again in any official recommendations. There was a doctoral student at Cornell in 1982 named Maria Hernandez who did her dissertation on traditional Haudenosaunee agriculture. She worked with elders from the 6 nations and measured actual yields from plots maintained using pre-colonial methods. Her findings showed caloric production of 3,000 to 3,500 calories per square foot depending on variety and weather conditions. She documented that the soil carbon increased every year instead of depleting. She proved that the system was sustainable indefinitely without external inputs. Her dissertation is in the Cornell Library Archive, and I've never seen it cited in a single mainstream agricultural textbook. The mechanism is simple enough that it makes you angry. Nobody teaches it. Corn is a heavy nitrogen feeder. Beans pull nitrogen from the air through bacteria in their root nodules and deposit it in the soil. Squash leaves create a living mulch that keeps moisture in and weeds out while adding organic matter as they decompose. The 3 plants create a closed nutrient cycle that maintains soil fertility naturally. Modern agriculture breaks this cycle and then sells you synthetic fertilizer to replace what the system would provide for free. In 1996, researchers at the University of California analyzed the protein quality of traditional corn and bean combinations. They found that eating them together gave you a protein efficiency ratio comparable to meat. The lysine in beans compensated for the lysine deficiency in corn. The methionine in corn balanced the methionine shortage in beans. Together, they provided complete nutrition. Separately, they left you deficient. The indigenous peoples who developed this system understood nutritional biochemistry without laboratories or scientific instruments. They knew it because they paid attention for thousands of years. A soil scientist named Elaine Ingham did research in 2004 showing that the Three Sisters system increased beneficial soil fungi by 400% compared to tilled monoculture. Those fungi networks help plants access nutrients and water while protecting against disease. Modern agriculture kills them with tillage and chemicals, then wonders why crops need constant intervention to survive. The system that worked for millennia built soil life. The system we replaced it with creates biological deserts that require life support. All this research exists. It's published in journals and dissertations and government reports, but it never makes it into the agricultural extension programs that tell farmers what to grow. It never appears in the textbooks that teach the next generation. The science proved the old ways worked better, and that proof got buried because it threatened every input company's business model. My daddy bought his first tractor in 1962. It was a Ford 8N, and he was proud of it the way men get proud of machines. But that tractor changed everything about what he could grow and what made economic sense to grow. See, you can't drive a tractor through a field of mounded Three Sisters plantings. The spacing is wrong, the height is varied, the harvest times are different. That tractor required straight rows of single crops at uniform heights that could be worked with attachments. The agricultural extension agent came by that same year and told him he was wasting his time with mixed plantings, said the future was in specialization and mechanization, told him he could work 3 times the land with that tractor if he'd just plant one thing in straight rows. Never mind that the mixed plantings produced more food per acre. The math they used didn't count total nutrition or calories. It counted bushels of a single commodity that could be sold into a standardized market. Here's what happened across this whole country in the span of about 20 years. The government subsidized mechanization through cheap loans and tax breaks. If you bought a tractor, you could write it off. If you bought chemical fertilizers, the government helped pay for them. But there were no subsidies for saving seeds or maintaining diverse plantings or building soil health. The financial incentives all pushed in one direction, toward monoculture that required purchased inputs. My uncle farmed 200 acres in Iowa, and he told me that by 1970 you couldn't make the numbers work unless you specialized. The grain elevators wanted pure loads of one crop. The seed companies sold hybrids that couldn't be saved and replanted. The chemical companies convinced everyone that weeds and pests were enemies that required annual chemical warfare. The whole system got restructured so that the only profitable path required buying products every single year from corporations. It wasn't that the Three Sisters stopped working. The soil didn't forget how to grow them. The plants didn't lose their ability to cooperate. What changed was the economic structure around farming. A method that required no purchased inputs couldn't generate profit for anyone except the farmer. And the entire agricultural industry was being reorganized around corporate profit, not farmer independence. The land-grant universities that used to teach diverse agriculture started taking money from chemical companies and equipment manufacturers. By 1975, my cousin went to agricultural school and never heard a single lecture about intercropping or traditional methods. The curriculum was entirely built around industrial monoculture. The professors who remembered the old ways retired and weren't replaced. The knowledge was deliberately removed from institutional memory. I watched it happen to my own family. My grandpa's brother held out until 1983, still planting his Three Sisters garden every year while farming commodity corn on his main acreage. The garden fed his family better than the corn fed his bank account, but the bank didn't care what he ate. They cared about cash flow from commodity sales. When he needed a loan to replace equipment, the bank looked at his acres in production, not his ability to feed himself. The garden acres didn't count as real farming. The tractors didn't kill the Three Sisters because they were better at producing food. They killed them because food production stopped being the point. The point became generating revenue for input suppliers and creating dependence on industrial systems. A farmer who could feed himself without purchasing anything was a failed customer, not a successful farmer. The whole definition of agricultural success got rewritten to serve corporate interests, and methods that created independence got labeled as backwards and eliminated. In 1973, the USDA changed the official definition of what counted as a farm. They raised the minimum gross sales requirement to qualify for agricultural programs and support. My grandpa's cousin had been growing the Three Sisters on 5 acres and feeding 3 families plus selling surplus at the local market. Under the new definition, he wasn't a farmer anymore. He was a hobbyist. He didn't qualify for crop insurance, agricultural loans, or disaster assistance. But the guy down the road growing 200 acres of soybeans in a biological wasteland, he got every benefit the government offered. The Cooperative Extension Service used to teach diverse methods. My grandma remembered agents coming around in the 1940s with information about companion planting and soil building and seed saving. But by the 1980s, every publication they distributed came with logos from chemical companies and equipment manufacturers at the bottom. The advice changed to match the sponsors. Extension agents started telling people that saving seeds was inefficient and that hybrid vigor required purchasing new genetics every year. I found a memo in the National Archives from 1968. It was from the USDA to state extension offices, and it recommended phasing out educational materials related to traditional intercropping methods. The reasoning stated was that these methods didn't align with modern agricultural efficiency standards, and that teaching them might discourage farmers from adopting recommended practices. Recommended practices meant practices that required purchasing products from the companies funding agricultural research. The seed companies consolidated through the 70s and 80s. Companies that used to sell open-pollinated varieties that farmers could save got bought out by chemical manufacturers. By 1995, you couldn't find traditional Three Sisters corn varieties in any major seed catalog. Burpee didn't carry them. Park Seed didn't list them. Young's dropped them from their catalog. If you wanted those genetics, you had to know someone who'd been saving them privately, outside the commercial system. My daddy tried to get information from the Extension Office in 1987 about growing traditional varieties. The agent told him those seeds were obsolete and that modern hybrids were superior in every way. When Daddy asked about not needing fertilizer with bean intercropping, the agent said that nitrogen fixation was inefficient compared to anhydrous ammonia application. The fact that one was free and built soil, while the other cost money and killed soil biology, didn't factor into the efficiency calculation. There was a systematic removal of this knowledge from every official channel. The agricultural schools stopped teaching it. The extension services stopped recommending it. The seed companies stopped selling the varieties. The USDA programs stopped recognizing it as legitimate agriculture. And within one generation, knowledge that had sustained peoples for thousands of years became something only old folks remembered and young people thought was primitive. I talked to a woman in Cherokee, North Carolina, in 2006 who told me her grandmother was punished in Indian boarding school for talking about traditional agriculture. The teachers told her that Indian farming methods were savage and inefficient, that she needed to forget those ways and learn modern American agriculture. This was in the 1930s, part of a deliberate program to erase indigenous knowledge and replace it with dependence on industrial systems. The forgetting wasn't accidental drift or natural progress. It was policy. It was curriculum decisions. It was funding choices that rewarded corporate-dependent methods and punished independence. Every institution that could have preserved this knowledge instead chose to bury it, and they did it because farmers who could feed themselves without purchasing inputs were bad for business. The entire structure of American agriculture was reorganized around creating dependence, and traditional knowledge was a threat to that model. In 2012, I met a young farmer named Sarah Blackfeather at the Asheville Farmers Market. She was selling the most beautiful corn I'd ever seen outside my grandmother's garden. Red kernels, blue kernels, white and yellow all on the same ear. She told me she gotten the seeds from her grandfather, who'd hidden them from the government agents during the relocation period. She was planting them the old way again, with beans and squash, on 7 acres in Haywood County. She said her first year people told her she was wasting her time. Her third year, she had a waiting list of customers who wanted her produce, and other farmers asking how she grew without chemicals. There's a group called the Seed Savers Exchange that started in 1975. A man named Diane Ott Wheely and her husband Kent started saving heirloom seeds that were disappearing from commercial catalogs. Today they maintain over 20,000 varieties, including dozens of traditional Three Sisters combinations from different tribal nations. People are requesting those seeds now faster than they can grow them out. In 2020, they told me requests for traditional intercropping varieties increased by 300%. A farmer named Mark Shepard in Wisconsin started planting what he calls restoration agriculture in 2001. He's using perennial versions of the Three Sisters concept on over 100 acres. He documented his yields in a book published in 2013, showing that his system produces more calories per acre than conventional grain farming while building soil and requiring zero external inputs. His farm has become a teaching site where thousands of people have come to learn methods that were nearly erased. The Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania has been running side-by-side trials since 1981 comparing organic methods, including intercropping against conventional monoculture. After 40 years of data, their results show that diverse plantings out-yield monocultures during drought years and match them during ideal years while building soil carbon and eliminating chemical dependency. Their research papers are freely available online, showing what my grandpa knew from experience. I visited a permaculture farm in Virginia last summer, run by a man named James Chin. He's first-generation American, came here from Taiwan, and he's growing the Three Sisters using methods he learned from Iroquois farmers in New York. He told me he feeds 40 families year-round from 3 acres using intensive intercropping. He keeps records, and his caloric production per square foot averages 2,800 calories. He's not guessing or estimating. He weighs everything and calculates it. He's proving the old numbers were real. There are seed libraries popping up in towns across this country. I know of 12 within 50 miles of where I'm sitting. People are saving varieties and sharing them outside the commercial system. The library in Bascom, North Carolina, started one in 2017. They have traditional Cherokee corn varieties, genuine cornfield beans, and Cherokee tan squash available for anyone who wants to grow them. You check out seeds like books, grow them, save seeds, and return more than you borrowed. Young farmers are choosing this path deliberately now. They're rejecting the debt and chemical dependency of industrial agriculture and going back to methods that create independence. I've talked to dozens of them at markets and farm tours. They're not doing it because it's romantic or nostalgic. They're doing it because the math works better and the food is better, and they're not trapped in a system designed to keep them barely surviving. The knowledge didn't die. It went underground and waited. And now it's coming back because people are remembering that independence matters more than efficiency measured in corporate profit. This isn't just about one planting method or 3 crops that work well together. This is about a pattern that repeats across every aspect of our food system. My grandpa grew a dozen heritage crops that have similar stories. Sunchokes that produce more calories per acre than potatoes and spread themselves without replanting. Amaranth that grows in poor soil and gives you grain and greens from the same plant. Groundnuts that fix nitrogen and produce protein-rich tubers without any care at all. Every single one of them got erased and replaced with crops that require annual purchases. The pattern is always the same. A crop or method works beautifully and creates independence for the people using it. Then the economic system changes to make that independence unprofitable. Then the institutions stop teaching it. Then it gets labeled as primitive or inefficient. Then it disappears from availability. Then within one generation people forget it ever existed. And then we're told that the corporate dependent system we're left with is the only way things could possibly work. I've spent 15 years now documenting these stories, talking to old folks before they pass, finding the research that got buried, growing out seeds that almost vanished, and every single time I find another piece of lost knowledge, I get angry about what was stolen from us. Not just the crops themselves, but the independence they represented, the ability to feed yourself without asking permission, the security of knowing that no matter what happened in the economy, or the government, or the world, you had the knowledge and the seeds to survive. That's what threatens the system, not the plants themselves, but what they represent. A farmer who can feed his family without purchasing inputs isn't a good customer. A community that saves seeds and shares knowledge doesn't create profit for corporations. A method that works indefinitely without degrading resources can't be sold as a product year after year. The erasure happened because success without dependence is bad for business. But here's what they didn't count on. Knowledge doesn't die as easily as they thought. It hides in old people's memories and mason jars and cellars and handwritten notes in family Bibles. It waits in seed banks and small gardens and communities that never fully bought into the industrial system. And when that system starts failing, when the costs become unbearable and the soil dies and the chemicals stop working, people go looking for what was lost. We're in that moment right now. The industrial system is cracking. Input costs are rising faster than crop prices. Soil is depleting. Water is running out. And young people are realizing that the path they were told to follow leads to debt and dependence in land they can never afford. So they're asking the questions that lead back to what worked before. And the knowledge is still here, waiting to be remembered. My grandpa told me something 3 days before he died. He said the most valuable thing he could leave me wasn't land or money. It was seeds and the knowledge of how to use them. He said that as long as someone remembers how to grow food without depending on systems that can be taken away, we'll survive whatever comes. And he made me promise to pass it on, to not let the knowledge die with his generation. That's what I'm doing here, telling you what was deliberately forgotten so you can't say you didn't know. The three sisters are still here. The seeds still exist. The method still works exactly like it did for thousands of years. And every person who learns it and plants it and saves those seeds is one more person who can't be controlled through their dependence on corporate food systems. The knowledge waits in the dirt. All you have to do is remember it exists and decide it's worth saving. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about what we erased and how to bring it back. This isn't history.